can't take this anymore!
Welcome to today's Explainer. You know, back in 2026, the roads of Ireland saw something we honestly rarely witness with such intensity anymore. We're talking mass fuel blockades, convoys rolling, intersections completely jammed, and public anger just absolutely boiling over. But as a political scientist, when I look at events like this, I always have to ask the hard questions. Like, months later, did anything actually change? Well, today, we're going to use those 2026 Irish fuel protests as a literal textbook case study. We're going to dive into the complex and, let's be real, often frustrating dynamics between massive public anger and the very real systemic limits of government policy.
Okay, let's look at the roadmap for today's Explainer. We're going straight from the root causes in the boiling point, looking at demands versus political reality, jumping into short and long-term impacts, unpacking the global policy trap, and finally defining what protest success really means.
All right, Section 1, the boiling point when cost of living meets carbon taxation. Let's set the stage here. To truly understand civic action, we have to look at the socioeconomic environment that sparked it. Because look, these blockades didn't just fall out of a clear blue sky, right? Three overlapping factors drove this massive eruption. We had naturally rising base fuel prices, a steep climb in the general cost of living, and, absolutely crucially, increasing carbon taxes. In political science, we spend a lot of time studying how taxation influences public support for policy. And carbon taxes? Well, while they are designed to combat climate change, they almost always act as a massive lightning rod for public backlash. When you compound those taxes with an environment where people's basic living expenses are already skyrocketing, boom, you get an intensely volatile political mix. Now, what's really fascinating here is how we can anchor all of that broad academic theory into one stark, real-world number. €1.80 to €2 per liter of fuel. When prices pushed toward this threshold, the frustration just couldn't be contained anymore. To put that into perspective, this wasn't just some abstract statistic on a spreadsheet. This was a daily, relentless financial drain that was literally pushing households right over the edge. Which brings us to a fundamental friction point. For rural communities, fuel isn't optional. It is survival. This hits the nail on the head regarding the intense clash between macro-level climate policies, usually designed by people in capital cities, and the micro-level realities of living out in the country. If you live outside a major city, you know you can't just hop on a subway to get to work or drop the kids off. This explains exactly why this specific issue totally bypassed polite debate and just boiled over so intensely into the streets.
Moving on to Section 2, Demands versus Political Reality, the Anatomy of a Protest.
So now that we understand the pressure cooker, let's look at who was actually out there. This wasn't just some fringe group. We are talking about a massive broad coalition. Truck drivers, farmers, daily commuters, small business owners, the whole shebang. This is a huge demographic of folks who rely on fuel every single day just to keep their livelihoods afloat. And in the lead up to these blockades, this massive chunk of society felt entirely, completely ignored by the political establishment. So what do they actually want? Well, they brought very clear, immediate, and totally non-abstract demands to the table. They wanted the government to reduce or pause fuel taxes, cut the carbon tax increases entirely, give targeted relief to rural drivers, and address those crushing cost of living pressures. They weren't asking for, actually scratch that, they had absolutely no interest in vague societal shifts. They wanted immediate, mathematical relief right there at the fuel pump.
But here is where we hit a fascinating dynamic between expectation and reality. The protesters' working hypothesis was pretty straightforward. If we physically block roads and grind logistics to a halt, the government will be forced to instantly slash taxes. But the institutional reality? Very different. The government publicly acknowledged the pressure, sure, but in practice, they only offered really small, temporary measures while strictly continuing their long-term climate commitments. As a political scientist, I find this statistical relationship so interesting to point out to students. A massive surge in protest size absolutely does not guarantee a mathematically proportionate government response, especially when structural policies are deeply, deeply entrenched.
Which brings us nicely to Section 3, short and long-term impacts. Attention versus action.
Let's evaluate what actually happened here. If we want to measure effectiveness, we really have to look at it across different timelines.
In the short term, the protests definitely secured wins. They totally dominated the headlines, they forced political attention, and they brought the insane cost of fuel to the absolute center of the national debate. And make no mistake, that kind of agenda setting is a very real, tangible form of power. But let's look at the long-term reality. There was no major policy reversal. Carbon taxes kept right on going up, and fuel pricing remained pretty much exactly aligned with the rest of Europe. So the protests successfully forced a dialogue, yes, but they fundamentally failed to deliver permanent structural change.
So why didn't they get that structural change? Let's dive into Section 4, the global policy trap, limits of local action.
This brilliantly illustrates why local governments struggle so much to accommodate intense local demands. They're caught in a global web. Think of it like a giant puzzle where local politicians only hold a few of the pieces. First, you have EU policy, which mandates alignment with broader European regulations. Second, international climate targets create legally binding commitments. You literally can't just casually roll back carbon taxes without breaking massive international agreements. And third, global oil markets dictate the baseline cost of fuel, totally regardless of whatever the local tax rate happens to be. So even with immense public pressure completely blocking the streets, local governments are structurally trapped. They just don't have the levers to pull to give the protesters what they want. And that leads us to our final part today, Section 5, Defining Protest Success, a Final Verdict. Taking everything we've just analyzed, I want to challenge your preconceived notions a bit here. What actually makes a protest successful? Think about it. Is success strictly measured by immediate, tangible policy wins at the legislative level? Or is success measured by broader agenda-setting powers, the ability to force a whole society to look at a problem they were previously just ignoring? When we weigh it all out, the 2026 fuel protests leave us with a bit of a split verdict. Their successes? They absolutely forced attention. They highlighted very real, crushing demographic pressures, and they started necessary conversations. But the failures are equally clear. They yielded zero major policy shifts and provided no lasting price relief for the people on the ground. Basically, if the goal was to send a message, that message was heard loud and clear. But if the goal was structural reshaping, well, the effort fell short.
So the crucial point here can be captured beautifully by a simple real-world analogy. If you've ever seen the classic Irish sitcom Father Ted, you might remember this famous quote, "Down with this sort of thing, but also, careful now." It perfectly, and I mean perfectly, summarizes the government's non-committal pacification strategy during these protests. The state acknowledged the anger, essentially saying, yes, down with high prices, but simultaneously maintained the status quo, saying, careful now, we have strict international obligations we can't break. It is a masterful, if incredibly frustrating, example of political pressure management. Which leaves us right here. Did the protests actually work, or were they ultimately ineffective? As you can see, civic action is rarely black and white. It's a messy, complex negotiation between the will of the public and the very rigid limits of the system. I really hope this explainer has given you a solid, structured framework to analyze not just these 2026 Irish fuel protests, but literally any mass civic action you see popping up in the news. So I'll leave you with this. Knowing what you know now, what do you think is the true measure of a protest's power? Thank you so much for learning with me today, and as always, keep questioning the systems around you.